welcome Dr. Heather Darby, to share her screen. She already is. And Phil talked to us with us a little bit about the very start of plants and plant growth. And Heather might have something to share about the unexpected or untimely end.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chris and Phil. That was fascinating. Chris called me and we were chatting about different topics for the seminar today. And when the phone rang, I was thinking about forages, and then I just started rambling on about my fears, what was happening in my head, and the concern I have about Vermont's perennial forages. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about how, the climate, the changing climate, the challenging climate is really impacting Vermont's grasslands, and thinking a little bit about what are we going to do? Should we do anything? What's happening? What is some of the research that we have going on? And just really, I think, putting it out there more to everyone else as something that's really critical for us to be thinking about. And I feel like maybe hasn't gotten the attention that it needs. So again, is the climate challenging Vermont's pastures of plenty? And I think the thing I really wanted to draw your attention to is that this thought that our grasslands are under attack, like many of the rest of us, to the changing climate is real. And when we think about grasslands in this conversation of climate change, commonly what we're actually talking about is how grass is protecting the environment, how perennial forages are sequestering carbon and really helping to mitigate some of the climate issues that we have today, and the important role that they play in that. Now in Vermont, most of our agricultural land is actually in grasslands. And here is maybe not such a great graph, but a graph showing non-agricultural land area in Vermont. So this is mostly forested land. That's what makes up most of our land base, followed by what is classified as grasslands, pasture land. So you can see what a huge part of the landscape this is in Vermont, both the agricultural, but the landscape itself. And then you can see this sort of tannish area way at the bottom, and this tannish area is what's classified as hay crop or silage hay, or haylage, I should say. And you can see that that's a large component too. This is also grasslands that may be in rotation with annual crops. And then you can see this tiny little blip in here, this kind of orangish line and a little bit of this red line. That's annual crops. Okay, so if the climate is truly challenging and putting our grasslands at risk, this is a huge, huge, and should be a huge concern in our state. And then to put that into even a bigger perspective, 2/3 of all the agricultural land in the United States is also grasslands, and 70% of global agricultural lands are also grasslands. And the conversation I do not generally hear going on is, are they at risk? We're talking a lot about in Vermont in particular, maple trees, what's going to happen, huge to our economy and to our landscape, but so aren't grasslands. And what's happening there, and what should we be thinking about? Let's see if I can get to the next slide. So Chris gave me these slides. I tried to use them, Chris. I really wanted to. I know you put some work into them. So what's the problem? He was really pushing my logic model and reporting here. But the problem here is that perennial cool season forages are at the heart of not only the Vermont agricultural landscape, but the Vermont landscape in general. And that's our environmental landscape too. So perennial forages, they have a significant agricultural and environmental value, not just to our state, but to the entire globe. The significant acreage of land is being impacted by the changing climate. And it's something we're not necessarily talking about or really even researching. We're more focused on what they can do for us and not really thinking about what's happening to them under increasingly wet conditions, longer periods of drought, more pests, milder winters, all of these things. So without perennial cool season forages, our landscape, tourism, the way we function in our state, the watersheds, the environment, and our farms, they're all at significant risk. So approach and methods, the solution. I wish I had the solution, but some of the things that we are doing, at least within my camp, are evaluating the forages right now. We see forages that we normally grow in our landscape, they're failing. So we have to reevaluate that, the species and the variety, just really basic information. What we used to recommend in the past to farmers to grow is changing. And then evaluation of management. How are we going to manage under this changing climate so that we can not only have these productive grasslands for our farming operations, but also to have really productive grasslands to protect the environment, to sequester the carbon that we need sequestered out of the atmosphere. These are some of the things that we are looking at here at UVM. A bigger challenge that I feel like we're falling short across the globe is breeding. Breeding forages for a changing climate is something that's really, it's not being done. It's not really being done at public institutions or at land grants, and that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit. And then, of course, outreach and education. CalzX, go. That's my new thing, CalzX. Let's, keep creating that high value, important research, and then making sure that we get it out to the people that need it, that are on the ground, that are going to implement it, and protect the landscape here and around the world. So, a couple of things I wanted to bring up. One being that, we have a pretty significant livestock industry in the state. Our landscape is suitable for that, of course. Rolling hills and rocky ground is good for growing trees and good for growing grass. And, because of our landscape, that's why we do have a dairy industry here and a beef industry and other livestock. Our landscape is very suitable for it, and so isn't our climate. A nice temperate climate with plentiful rainfall. So this has also created new opportunities and new markets that people are taking advantage of, and we're hearing a lot about. We're also getting a lot of push from various sectors and industries and environmental groups and advocacy groups to have more animals back out on pasture, involved in organic dairy production, and in these new markets that are really interesting to farmers and to consumers, that are 100% grass fed, which means, in terms of dairy and beef as well, that these animals, these livestock, are only fed grass and legumes, other types, other mixtures of forages. And this seems great on so many levels. It's a value added market, it's grass, it's protecting the environment. But what we don't talk about is that it's super risky, and that these particular farms that are only relying solely on this type of feed are at huge risk during this extremely challenging climate. These farmers are having to get 100% of their diet from what's growing out on the grasslands, whether it's put up as stored feed or the animals are out there grazing it. So what happens to these farms in a drought, in a really wet year? I mean, both of which we experience yearly now. And these farmers are having a really tough time. And many of them just, they don't have enough feed. And so even though our vision of grasslands and added value markets and protecting the environments is great and probably right along a trajectory that we should all be thinking about, I think it's important to truly understand that climate is making these farms less resilient instead of more. So this is something we really need to be talking about. So on farms themselves, homegrown grass is the best feed for those livestock and the cheapest. And so this is really an economic issue on all farms across the Northeast. And really all farms, all ruminant farms. You know, forage is at the heart of those diets. And here is some research we have been working on with my team, myself and Jeff Sanders, Rory Malone, in particular Lindsay Rule, helping to collect all this data. And you can see, this is from one farm, but I just want to show this point that here in July, so this is July 7th, this particular farm was producing 60 pounds of milk per cow per day, which is pretty good. And you can see down at the bottom with the gray line here, it shows you the percent of homegrown feed that that farm is feeding. So they're making the most milk, basically, that they're making almost all year long. And you can see that they're feeding the most homegrown forage as well. Nearly 100% of everything those animals were getting was coming from that farm, primarily in the form of grass. This farm does feed a little bit of corn silage, but not much. So my other take-home point here is how much is it costing that farm to feed those cows? And you can see right here, $1 per cow per day, the cheapest feeding on that farm with the best output, both in milk yield and quality. I didn't have enough space to put everything on here, occurred when that farm was feeding their own homegrown forage. So this is a huge economic viability component on all of our livestock farms across the state, and environmental. So, you know, I think this is a huge opportunity for us in our state to continue to support our livestock industry and um, helping them produce the highest quality, highest yielding grass and legume based feed from their farms, because it helps them stay viable. It helps the livestock also stay healthier, higher producing, and then the environment itself. The one thing I wanted to note, which comes up a lot in our conversations around the state, is, well, if all the cows were just eating grass, they would make more money. And that could be true in some cases, but I think the point I wanted to make is that farms are struggling to get enough homegrown forage into their animals. And some of that has to do with species selection, quality, and then feeding cows high forage diets. And so this is some data we collected from our grass only project showing the cash expenses on farms that do not feed grain. And you can see their biggest cash expense was buying forage. So my point here being that protecting those grasslands, making them as productive as possible under a changing climate or not, is really critical to the environment, the environmental outcomes, the landscape that we want, and the viability of farms in our state and beyond. This article came out a couple of years ago, and I want to bring this up. It's really important because we know how important grass is, but what we haven't done is invest in it. And this article is written by Jerry Cherney. He's at Cornell. He's one of what I would call a dying breed, which is a forage agronomist. And he wrote this article, Forage crops, they don't get no respect. They're in crisis, and this is true. Over the last 20 years, there's been a 50% decline in forage scientists, and most of those that are left at land-grant universities are actually pretty close to retirement. and those that are retiring or recently retired have not been rehired. This is obviously a huge concern when I just told you that 2/3 of all the agricultural land in this country is in grass, but we are not supporting research, extension, outreach, breeding um, to match really the agricultural landscape. And of course, the biggest hit has been in extension, where we've seen a 70% decline in extension, forage extension. I pulled this from the article. It's a little bit blurry, but it really gets the point across that the monetary value of forages for ruminants, food security, animal welfare, and ecosystem services has a huge value. But the investment that we're making, both federal and state support, is nil. That's not very scientific. The old, it is. My 8-year-old agreed. And again, if you just look at this, based on crop value, alfalfa is the third most valuable crop in our country. And you can see the research investment is nil. And you can see wheat has even fallen behind alfalfa. And the research investment in wheat is 10 times more than in alfalfa. So, this is a big concern, is going to continue to cause issues as the climate is changing, and we need those grasslands more and more and more and more to protect our landscape. So everybody has seen this. We know we're getting more rainfall in Vermont. We know it's getting warmer. A lot of this temperature increase is happening in the winter, and that does have an impact on our grasslands. But where I see the impact, I think, closer to home right now, is just less actual precipitation during some of the summer months when our forages are already not that productive. Remember, these are cool season forages, which means they like cool weather. So the hotter it gets, the less productive they are. And we are seeing these longer stretches of hot weather. And more hot conditions means less productive perennial cool season forages. We've always seen this sort of slump in the state of Vermont, but the slump is getting bigger. So the time period during the summer months where the perennial forages are less productive is growing and growing and growing. So we're looking at ways to overcome this. We're looking at legume persistence. Legumes are extremely important to the environment, to nitrogen cycling, to growing our own nitrogen on farms and protein, etc. And we're trying to figure out what are these species and varieties that are doing the best now in Vermont. And, a bit shocking to me was that alfalfa, once considered a crop that didn't grow well here, actually far outperformed survival over some of the other very standard forages that we have around the state: white clover and bird's foot trefoil. Pest pressures are getting worse. They're getting worse everywhere, and forages are no different. And so last summer, you probably saw it and maybe didn't know what it was, but you drive by a grass field and see like this bright, bright yellow color out there. And that was the alfalfa or the clover that was completely decimated by potato leafhoppers. And of course, those farmers had nothing to harvest. And so here we're looking at resistance. This is a potato leafhopper resistant variety on the top that's nice and green, and one that's not down below. So again, selection of varieties and species that are going to overcome these issues is critical right now. And here you can see different species of grasses that we grow in Vermont and how they're doing when we have these dry periods. You can see that orchard grass seems to stand up a little bit better than meadow fescue, but you can see a 50% decline in productivity. That is huge. Imagine losing 50% of your paycheck because we went through a drought. Okay, so we are trying to figure out how to overcome these issues as fast as we can. They're real. And, you know, here's just more data that we're collecting on the species as well as the varieties. There's a huge difference in how, here's perennial ryegrass, performs in drought conditions. And we want the variety that's going to perform well in drought, in wet, in cold, in hot. And that's what we're looking for as quick as possible. I'm probably running out of time, Chris. I can't see a clock. So,
Yeah, we're getting close.
okay. So, high rainfall events. Pasture gets overstocked and overgrazed. You know, this is all management, things that we can start to, you know, really hone in on with farmer. Here's some drought stressed plants. People are commonly clipping out in their fields. You know, this is a matter of changing the height of clipping, you know, a traditional practice, just changing what we're doing a little bit to overcome some of these issues. And, you know, we have some work to do, but I think mostly what I wanted to bring to people's attention is that we need to pay attention and how important this is to us in Vermont. And I'll end with that, Chris, so that we can get on with the questions.
Heather, thanks so much. Really appreciate you drawing our attention to that the importance of forages and the challenges we're being faced with there.